So I got a passage here from when I was in Washington, D.C. the first time going to court, like the federal court. And when I was kind of like we were making our rounds, we would get contacted by tons of journalists. Like sometimes I'd be on calls for 13 to 16 hours a day, and from folks all around the world and all the different time zones. And this was just a really kind of quirky story about names, the importance of names and identity, and also like demonstrates how poor my Mandarin was at the time. So as I started making plans for Washington, D.C., our guitarist Joe asked if he could join so that he could film a documentary about my journey through the courts. I set up a number of interviews for him with scholars in the area. A few Asian American organizations and teachers also asked me to speak at their schools. We ended up with a packed schedule that would keep us busy from morning to night. It felt like we were going on tour since I was trying to fill every minute of the day with something productive. Joe would pepper me with questions for his documentary while I drove the rental car. It was like I was constantly on. It felt a bit uncomfortable, even though it was a friend behind the lens. And sometimes a television crew or journalist would meet us on location for one of my appearances and ask even more questions. It was mentally and emotionally draining. And I'm fairly certain that I just stopped answering questions at one point because I wanted some kind of reprieve. In the middle of our trip, Joe's cousin Yin drove up from North Carolina to hang out with us. When he mentioned how hungry he was, even after we had already eaten 2 back-to-back meals, I knew we'd get along. At one point, I was doing an interview with a newspaper in China and was asked for my written Chinese name. I didn't know how to type Chinese characters, so I wrote out my name on a piece of paper and I asked for Joe's help. Joe was born and raised in China for most of his childhood, where I was being denied from being able to learn the language while I was in school. "What's that?" He stared, he rotated the paper, and he laughed. Yin looked over, but he couldn't make sense of what I had written either. "I only know how to write a few things in Chinese. My own name, the numbers 1 through 4, mom, and food. That's it. Or at least I thought that was it." "Well, some of these aren't even real characters," he said. "Say your name." Tom Shiwon? Tam Shiwon? I know, my pronunciation sucks. We then called up my dad to try and make sense of it. He tried explaining it over as well, but the intonation wasn't very clear over the phone. "Shu as in number, or are you saying shu as in book? Or is it like shu as in like unique?" With so many variations and possible combinations of characters in Chinese, it seemed impossible to decipher what was happening. It was ironic that while I was fighting so hard to fight for my identity, I couldn't even figure out how to write out my own name, even with the help of 3 other men who were born in China. Finally, after 30 minutes, we figured out my name, Tang Shuwen. I think we often forget the importance of names. I was actually born Simon Xiao Tam on March 31st, 1981. At least according to my parents. Growing up, I had a couple different middle names. My paper trail through the public school system will sometimes list my middle name as Hong, like my father's, and sometimes Xiao, from my mother's side of the family. I didn't really know which one to choose. I just knew that no matter what, the word began with an H, so that my initials of SHT would either be a badass proclamation or a target for ridicule. But this wasn't exactly the whole story. My birth certificate revealed that both my birthday and my name were wrong, at least according to the state. I was born Simon Xiaotam, but they spelled it S-H-I-A-O instead of H-S-A-I-O, and the date was March 30th, 1981. I was no longer SHT, but SST, something that sounded like a large, antiquated cargo barge. And there was a lot going on at the time. I could see how mistakes could be made. On the day I was really born, President Ronald Reagan and several of his staff members were shot in broad daylight. But the reality is that this isn't the first time the government screwed up names in my family. As different relatives entered the US and dealt with different officials, our family name was interpreted and recorded differently. That's why my father His parents, his grandparents, and his siblings all have different last names: Tam, Tom, Tong, and Tan. Identity matters. When simple mistakes are made due to ignorance or poor translation, these can create difficulties later on for families trying to communicate, share resources, or navigate government systems that often require accuracy. Identity is inherently tied with dignity. We should be able to define ourselves based on our own terms and to identify ourselves as part of a community. Yet, what we find is that people from marginalized groups often have others defining their identities for them: the status of their citizenship, the categories for racial and ethnic groups as defined by the dominant population, or, as in my family's case, how names are spelled and pronounced. This simple, lighthearted misunderstanding with the Chinese journalist reminded me of the importance of names. Some names are sacred, passed through generations for thousands of years. Through laziness and misinterpretation, our family name was butchered at the hands of immigration officials and getting further lost with each passing generation that was forced to assimilate. I vowed never to forget my name again. Some names are worth fighting for.
Very nice. That was really eye-opening, and I really liked the writing. It was very clear. And
oh, thank you.
Got your message across. And it's such a tragedy that they did all that stuff to your name. Did you get it corrected before you went to the Supreme Court? Like, was it possible?
No? Well, the Supreme Court is interesting in that they're still using the spelling from my birth certificate. Yeah. So I've kind of had to keep that misspelling in order to for taxes and other important government documents. But it also, the Supreme Court brief also shed some light on the carelessness and how they treat identity. So the official opinion from the Supreme Court actually lists me as the lead singer of the band, even though I've never been the lead singer of the band. And I'm like, is it because you can't tell us apart? Or is it because you couldn't even trouble yourself to do a quick search on Google, you know? And they actually got that piece of data because the trademark office, the entity that we're fighting against, also wrongly listed me as the lead singer. And it just shows like they didn't really actually care that much about the person. You know, they're thinking about these larger legal issues. But when you don't care about people who are at the heart of laws, you end up perpetuating these kind of inequities that will affect people in many different profound ways that they don't have to think about what it means for them. But like, you know, for me, it's a different lived reality. For example, like they're like, well, hey, if we get it wrong, you can always come and correct us, which sounds good in theory, but it took me over a decade to correct the government who assumed that the name on my band was racist. So for 10 years of me trying to pursue a music career, I had an actual government department calling me racist. And that affects me in all kinds of profound ways, including my own anti-racism work. They don't have to think about what that means, even though they were the ones that incorrectly identified me as such. But it just shows that like the importance of trying to change these systems to actually reflect the identities of the people who are affected by them, so that we don't have these kinds of mistakes continue to hurt people and harm them in all these other unexpected ways, so ways that, you know, are oftentimes not reported on because it's so complex. Like, how do you write a news story around it? How do you do a quick soundbite around it?
Now, your book was independently published, right? Like you published it yourself, or did you go to a publisher?
Well, we shopped it around for a while. I had two different book agents, and what was interesting is that unfortunately, the publishing industry is very much like the entertainment industry. There's still a lot of gatekeepers. I was told on a couple of occasions, like, we already have an Asian writer. Like from, I'll say that came from one of the four biggest publishers in the world. They said that to me. And I was like, but they write fiction. It's a completely different genre. And it's also a different human being. Like, I was like, I don't know, how many male writers do you have? You got problems with signing up more? Like, it was just mind boggling. And after going through that experience a couple different times, or like, you know, book editors are like, oh, this seems really important. I adopted someone from China. And just like experiencing those kinds of comments, I was like, no one should have to experience this again. So I actually started my own publishing company. Like I figured out how to do it step by step and created it. And then like this became the kind of the test book for it so that I could help publish other writers, particularly from those underrepresented backgrounds, so that they didn't have to kind of go through this like weird, like microaggression, like process. And I was just like, for me, like, it's kind of like the nonprofit. I just want to help people with expression and to get these stories and experiences out. So whatever I can do to ease the process, I will gladly do. And so this year, I'm actually helping publish a book of poetry for an up and coming poet. We've published a couple of books on like traditional folk tales. And so just trying to get these stories out there. And I was like, yeah, like it's kind of a funny thing. It's kind of like my band. I was like, if the system isn't working for us and it's actually creating harm, then what can we do to like subvert that entirely?
Yeah, I've been told by a pretty famous editor that my name was stupid because I used J.F. Garrard, so Jeannie Fong Garrard. So Garrard is actually my husband's last name, but I thought it'll be easier because I read a lot of science fiction and fantasy to hide the fact that I'm female and Asian. So that's why I did that. But he was telling me to stop it, but I'm like, well, that's what I've been using. So I don't think, I'm going to stop.
It's your name. I mean, well, J.K.
Exactly.
Rowling hid behind initials for the same purpose.
Yeah.
And, it's also kind of a pretty common convention for fantasy and sci-fi writers to use initials as well.
Yeah, it's true. So, okay. So this is all the time we have today. So thank you very much for being so generous with us by sharing your story. And I wish you best of luck on all your endeavors.